Well, of course, late last week, we learnt that HSBC and Standard Chartered banks got political, giving their backing to China's imposition of a so-called national security law on Hong Kong. Now, this imposition, it has to be said, breaks years of political neutrality for the UK-based banks. HSBC's Asia Pacific chief, a certain Peter Wong, signed a petition saying that HSBC, quote, respects and supports all laws that stabilise Hong Kong's social order. That's a very sort of cutesy way of saying they support a law put in place by a communist regime against the will of the people of Hong Kong to have their freedoms removed. Chartered, as I said, also UK-based, said it believed the law can, quote, help maintain the long-term economic and social stability of Hong Kong. Again, a little bit too cute by half. In truth, these two firms went to water when communist heavies put the squeeze on them, pressuring them to take a side in the China-Hong Kong fight and to make that public. Sadly, it seems greed triumphed over principle here. Well, the Chair of Parliament's Finance Committee out here, Liberal Senator James Paterson, is warning Australia's big banks against doing at HSBC, as it were. ANZ, NAB, the Commonwealth, Westpac and even Macquarie all have a presence in Hong Kong. All will no doubt be pressured by the Chinese authorities to make their position known. Hopefully they take the right decision. James Paterson joins me on the line. James, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Any indication yet whether the Australian banks have had words from Chinese heavies about which side they should be taking and make it public?
At this stage, no. That's not been publicly revealed, and I hope that's because it hasn't happened, or if it has happened, they've given it the short shrift that it deserves. But it is a real concern. As you pointed out, the conduct of HSBC and Standard Chartered, in my view, is very, very unwise. Not only are they rebuking the governments and oppositions of their home country, where they're actually based in the United Kingdom, they're also putting themselves on what I think is a very slippery slope. This might be the first request that the Chinese Communist Party makes of these banks in return for sparing them the threats that they would make, but it won't be the last. And the next request that they ask might be a harder one to refuse.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? When you appease a bully, it's very rarely the case that once you've sort of given in on one occasion, they'll leave you alone. They'll see you as weak and they'll come back for a second, third and fourth crack, and every time the stakes get higher. You would have thought smart people ran banks and they'd understand that.
I think that's right, Michael, and also I think their position of political neutrality, which they previously had, was an entirely and eminently defensible one, particularly when you're operating in some difficult non-democratic jurisdictions as these banks do. It is wise for them not to engage, particularly in public debates about contentious policy issues, and this one couldn't be more contentious. It is a flagrant breach of the 1997 British Sino Declaration that the Chinese Communist Party voluntarily signed up to. It's an agreement registered with the United Nations. It is supposed to be legally binding. It's an extraordinary thing for a British bank to be endorsing the Chinese government walking away from that commitment with the British government.
Well, indeed, and considering the British government have been quite open and public about the fact they're terribly disappointed but probably not surprised by the moves of Communist China, it does seem strange that a big publicly listed bank in Britain would go against their government. But I suppose, to be fair to HSBC for a minute, they've seen what's happened with Cathay Pacific. And thought, well, we don't want that here. And certainly the leadership have seen what happened to the leadership of Cathay Pacific, who decided to stand up for the freedoms and the limited democratic rights that exist for the citizens of Hong Kong, and they basically lost their job.
Well, Cathay Pacific's former CEO provided, I think, a masterclass in ethical and moral leadership. He refused to hand over the names of his employees who might have participated in the Hong Kong protests, and he lost his job over it. But I tell you what, he retained his integrity, and I think a lot of people will look up to leaders who take that stance. And I appreciate this is a difficult environment to operate in, and it's easy for a politician thousands of kilometres away to offer advice. But these banks, particularly Australian banks, have to think about how the Australian consumers would react to this. I don't think any customer of any of our major banks would welcome it if they got involved in a political debate, much less backed the Chinese Communist Party going against the rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong.
What does this say about China as a regime? Of course, Australia does an enormous amount of business with China, notwithstanding the boycotts and pressures on at the moment, all of that politically motivated, as we know. But, I mean, this does tell a bit of a story, doesn't it, about the mob we're dealing with over in Beijing?
Well, I think the thing that a lot of countries are realising, and Australia's not alone in this, is that the Chinese Communist Party of today is different to the Chinese Communist Party under previous leaders. Certainly it's a long way from Deng Xiaoping, but it's even different from Hu Jintao in the way in which Xi Jinping is just so overt and so open about the ambitions of global influence and authority that the Chinese Communist Party has, and the way in which they intend to reshape the global order in their interest to protect the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's not just Australia, it's India who's engaged in a serious border dispute with China. It's Sweden who's got booksellers who lived in Hong Kong being locked up in jail. It's the United Kingdom who's making very wise decisions now on Huawei. Every country around the world that has diplomatic relations with China is experiencing strained relations with China at the moment, and we in Australia would do well to remember we're not alone.
I saw Human Rights Watch last week make the point that, well, they asked the question, does HSBC now feel compelled to weigh in on other laws in other countries? They seem pretty mute on all of that, but they've caved in this time.
That's right. And clearly what happened in this case was senior Communist Party officials publicly said HSBC's business is at threat if it doesn't toe the line. They have bowed down to that request. And I just fear what the next request will be from the Chinese Communist Party, whether it'll be about the private data of clients of HSBC or something much more compromising that goes beyond mere statements. And if HSBC is again threatened of losing its right to conduct business in China, what will they do when they're faced with those challenges? At some point, they're going to have to say there's a bridge too far, that's something we're not willing to do, and they're going to have to take the risk that there'll be consequences for them and for their shareholders.
We've known for years, James, and I think increasingly people are waking up to this fact that it's difficult from a governmental point of view to have a relationship with a foreign player like China, as big and powerful and wealthy as they are, but as diametrically politically and ideologically opposed as they are with societies like ours. There's a natural friction in that relationship, and governments have done reasonably well to try to assuage all of that. But from a private capital point of view, are these companies now starting to wake up and understand, do you think, or maybe not understand, but they're starting to certainly be shown just how difficult it is to be a capitalist entity on the one hand, but do business in a communist society, the world's second biggest market, on the other?
I think that's a really important point, Michael, because these businesses do make a decision to engage in business in these difficult times and these difficult territories, and sometimes they are richly and handsomely rewarded for it. But there are risks involved when you do business in unfree jurisdictions. If you confine yourself just to rule of law jurisdictions, you're going to be fine. You're never going to face these kind of threats. But if you want to make an educated judgment and an educated calculated risk that you're going to do business in a place like China or elsewhere in the world where they don't have the rule of law or open democracy like we do, then you accept the good and bad that comes with that. You accept the good returns on investment that you might get in some years, and you accept the grave risks that your business will be exposed to in other years. And it's not good enough to come to politicians and say, oh, can you please be quiet about this because it hurts our business interests. We didn't tell you that you had to go and do business in that environment. You made a choice to do so.
Mind you, the politicians, particularly your side of politics, encouraged people to do business there, though. I mean, you did sign the free trade agreement with China and promised rivers of gold, and people followed your lead.
Well, we don't seek to politicise any of our trading relationships. Anyone who wants to buy our beef or our barley or our education or our tourism or any other export that we sell, they're welcome to it. We don't seek to politicise it at all, and we think both we and the country we do trade with benefits from it. Unfortunately, there are some countries, though, and China is one of them, that does from time to time seek to politicise a trade relationship, seeks to use it as leverage over us, and the only thing that we can do in those circumstances is demonstrate that it won't be successful, that no matter how hard they try, we won't back down from advocating our national interest, for standing up for our values, for defending our sovereignty, so they can try as long as they like, but it won't change our course.
Now, you've got a pretty senior position there, obviously the chair of the Parliament's Finance Committee. On these issues, no doubt you get your door knocked pretty hard by the lobbyists and some of the big business players when things get a bit tight. I'm not going to name them, but we have seen a few in the last couple of months come out and publicly basically ask the government and the Australian community to go a bit quiet on China and the criticism about the coronavirus and the handling of that, and because they made the point, well, look, it's not doing business that good. I think we should go back to normal if we can, folks. Let's just be quiet here and calm down. These are big players, big political donors, a lot of these people. Do they have too much influence in the debate?
Well, they haven't had much success in their efforts to shut down debate about our relationship with China or any other key issue. In fact, I think they've been found to be completely without influence on those questions, and I think that's a good thing because we can't have business, as much as we respect their ability to create jobs and produce great products and sell them overseas or in Australia. We respect them in that. We don't take their advice on foreign relations or international relations. That's beyond their expertise, and obviously some of them are really conflicted in that because they've got a vested interest in those relationships. But let's just pretend for a second we did follow their advice. The only way we could guarantee that Australia never faced any economic coercion or threats of economic coercion is if we never stood up for our values, we never stood up for our national interests, we allowed our sovereignty to be trampled all over. I don't actually think these business leaders want us to go down that road, and they should think very carefully about the advice that they give when they ask us to do that.
That's very well said, James. Before you go, a bit of a free kick, I suppose, really here. The situation with the Victorian Labor Party. We've seen yet again issue of branch stacking allegations come to light, and there's already been a bunch of resignations as a result. Of course, the Liberal side of politics are not immune from branch stacks. They've gone on in the past, we all know that. But, I mean, it seems to be a particular problem for the Labor Party in New South Wales and Victoria.
It's a slow-moving car crash, and it's got a long way to run yet. We've seen a couple of scalps so far, but I doubt they'll be the last, and I suspect there'll be recriminations in the Labor Party for years over these issues. They're actually proposing a federal intervention in the Victorian division of the Labor Party because they can't trust Victorians to run their own Labor Party, which is an extraordinary admission of how bad things are and how endemic the cultural problems are in this division. I doubt very much that it begins and ends with Mr Somyurek and one or two others. I suspect this goes across the board, across the factions, and if enough light and heat and attention is shown upon it, I think there'll be some very, very uncomfortable stories for the Labor Party for some time to come. There
is a particular concern, though, isn't there? And this, again, seems particularly acute with the Labor Party, but I don't think the coalition are immune completely with ethnic communities being used and abused to stack branches and basically paid to do so. You got basically ignorant people, and that's not a criticism, they're just ignorant of the way the whole political system works, being shoved into these branches to vote one way or another. They're in essence the useful idiots. This is becoming more and more apparent, it seems.
It's a very disturbing feature of modern politics, particularly in the Labor Party, and I hope it remains only a Labor problem and it is not seen in the Liberal Party. Certainly in Victoria we don't have any instances like that, but you could see the problem in the patronising way that Adam Somyurek was caught out speaking about some of these communities. He does not respect these communities. He's not interested in these communities very clearly by the comments that he makes, except for their ability to deliver him numbers and deliver him political support. And I think some of these communities are being preyed upon because many of them are new to Australia and they are not sophisticated operators within our political system. I think some people do seek to take advantage of them. I actively welcome the engagement of people from all different backgrounds in our political parties. I think would be strengthened by it. I'd love to see the Liberal Party have more members from diverse ethnic communities, but I want them to be there for their own reasons and at their own initiative because they share the values of the party, not because some opportunistic factional warlord is going around and moving the numbers around on a chessboard. That is really appalling behaviour.
Probably would help if they actually knew the name of the Premier, right?
Well, yes, that was
good
spectacular footage in 60 Minutes last night that some members of the Labor Party don't know the Premier's name. That, I think, exposes the cynicism of this exercise.
Plenty of people in China know his name, though, funnily enough.
That's true. And guys, the Belt and Road Initiative is the other slow-moving car crash in Victoria. Daniel Andrews just can't seem to see common sense on that, no matter what anyone else says, whether it's Penny Wong or Richard Miles or Anthony Albanese. They seem utterly incapable of shifting him, even though they say they disagree with him.
Good to talk to you, James. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Michael.
My pleasure. James Paterson, as I said, Liberal Senator for Victoria and Deputy Chair of the Select Committee on COVID-19, among other things.